a narrow, breathless whisper of a moment. Imagine a windless morning in a remote stretch of limestone country where maps end and stories begin. Beneath your boots, the earth gives a sound that is not quite soil and not quite stone, a hollow like the throat of a sleeping giant. You step closer, the light shifts, and a seam in the rock reveals itself, not a cave at all, but a doorway carved with a hand that knows secrets. Inside, the air is cool and impossibly old. The beam of your flashlight finds something no tourist brochure ever mentioned: a corridor of carved symbols, pottery shards glazed with a pigment that shouldn't exist on this side of the ocean, and a chest whose ironwork is stamped not with a Maker S mark, but with a date that disagrees with everything you were taught in school. For a heartbeat, you understand why men move mountains to keep places like this quiet. What follows is a discovery that threads together vanished families, an unsolved map, and a decision recorded in the logs of men who swore to protect the public. A decision to sit on the discovery and call it classified. Imagine now that someone leaked a single photograph, and the internet did what it always does. It laughed, it hunted, it refused to stop until the walls were talking. This is the story of the cave America tried to hide how it was found, what it contained, and why the truth became more complicated than the rumor. The first time word reached me, it came from a rusty inbox and a name I didn't recognize, a volunteer part tech who'd been cataloging abandoned survey markers on a state land that nobody thought to patrol. He'd been tracing faint pencil lines on a weathered topographic sheet, lines that suggested a sinkhole where the modern maps insisted there was none. Alone, he descended into a cleft that opened like a lip in the hills and found a chamber with ladders of hand-chiseled stone and a ceiling thick with soot from torches long since cold. The spot was not on any public record. The only reason the marker existed at all was because, decades earlier, a private contractor had been paid to stabilize a property and then vanish. Inside the chamber, he found artifacts stacked in deliberate rows, bundles wrapped in an oilcloth that smelled faintly of pitch-sealed letters in wax, and a ledger bound in leather that recorded names and payments to men listed as consultants. The ledger's handwriting matched no known script in the county registrar. It used an older calendar system and referenced shipments that should have been impossible for the time. By the time he called the regional office, the desk clerk asked him to leave the site untouched and promised to dispatch a team. When the team did arrive, they came with tape, tags, and a folder that had been stamped restricted. The original volunteer's photograph disappeared from his phone. Later, his messages to the press were met with silence, and then with official denials that anything had ever been found. It felt like a puzzle piece that fit none of the edges, and the edges were starting to close. As the story spread, first in private forums, then on late-night podcasts, and finally into a cascade of amateur sleuth blogs, a pattern emerged from fragments. The pottery shards bore a glaze whose composition included trace elements typical of old-world coastal kilns. But the vessel styles were unmistakably native to the continent. The inscriptions paired iconography from two worlds separated by centuries of ocean and ignorance. Anthropologists who examined the photos sent in by readers were torn. Some argued for a pre-Columbian contact site, a rare place where trade or migration might have left a tangible footprint. Others warned of contamination, later planting, or the persuasive power of wishful interpretation. Meanwhile, the ledger's entries suggested something more deliberate: payments for safekeeping and references to a committee tasked with mitigating public unrest who would finance such an effort. Private collectors, a corporation worried about land rights, or a government agency calculating that knowledge of the cave might destabilize communities or reopen wounds better left healed. The ledger names read like a who's who of small-town elites: landowners, a university curator, a contractor whose company had been hired to manage retrieval. It looked, in short, less like a natural archive and more like a ledger for a plan. When journalists first tried to pry deeper, the doors closed fast. Freedom of Information requests returned redacted pages. The registrar insisted their records showed no permits for archaeological work on that parcel, and a federal office replied that certain investigations were ongoing. Yet every attempt to layer fact over rumor revealed another stratum of obfuscation: email threads with phrases like soft release and managed narrative, contracts that rerouted ownership of recovered artifacts to shell entities, and insurance policies that made the whole discovery look like a strategic asset rather than cultural heritage. In small towns, whispers mattered more than headlines. A retired mason recalled helping install stonework on a nearby foundation the year the ledger's first payment was dated. A woman who ran a diner in the nearest town remembered a convoy of trucks that had come in at dawn decades ago and left with tarpaulins stretched over their cargo. These were not the deeds of a single man acting alone. This was a networked decision, carried out by people who had access, motive, and the ability to create plausible paperwork. It is here the story splits into two: the history contained in the cave itself, and the history of why powerful people insisted that history stay inside a locked vault. Inside the chamber, the artifacts painted a portrait that complicated every tidy narrative. There were seed packets cataloged in a hand with marginal notes indicating origin and storage conditions, references to plants, cultivated in climates unlike those known in the immediate region. There was a necklace strung with shells that, under chemical analysis, matched a coastline thousands of miles away, but fashioned with tools and techniques consistent with local traditions. There were iron fittings on a small wooden chest that dated earlier than iron production in the area should allow. Most unsettling of all were the letters, correspondences between individuals with different geographic signatures, thanking one another for discreet passage and referencing a treaty whose terms included the protection of certain lineages in exchange for silence. If authentic, these items suggested not a single moment of contact but a slow, secret weaving of connections, trade, intermarriage, shared sanctuary, carried out by people who understood the consequences of being discovered. Why hide it? Possible answers came in shapes that were as practical as they were moral. Land claims that hinged on a narrative of firstness, institutions that risked losing funding if their founding myths were challenged, or communities who might be thrust into conflict if histories were rewritten overnight. Each explanation was a reminder that history is not discovered in a vacuum. It lands inside societies that have their own debts, fears, and incentives. By the time independent researchers organized an expedition funded by crowdfunding and grainy donations, the cave had become more than a geological curiosity. It was a mirror. In the lantern glow, volunteers found evidence of care: multiple layers of repairs to the walls, rope handholds replaced over decades, and a small altar of offerings that blended motifs from different cultures. Someone had lived here, or at least passed through often, leaving traces that suggested kinship across oceans rather than conquest. The most jarring find was a map, drawn on treated hide, that stitched together coastlines with inland markers written in a hybrid script. It was not proof of a single voyage so much as proof of an ongoing relationship, a road less shouted about and more gently maintained. When the team published their findings in a small but rigorous journal, they did so with meticulous documentation: soil samples, carbon dating results, and chain of custody logs. The journal piece prompted an avalanche of secondary coverage. Scholars who had been skeptical now asked to re-examine data, and the public who had once shared memes now debated implications. Yet within days, a federal agency announced a review and requested the samples be transferred for further study. The samples were taken, the public commentary shifted, and the tone changed from excitement to exasperation. Who exactly decides when and how history is revealed? The last scene of the cave's public life is quiet and complicated. In town halls, elders told stories that contradicted the ledger, naming ancestors who had favored secrecy to protect vulnerable kin. Lawyers wrote letters arguing about property and the rightful ownership of artifacts. Universities convened panels that read like peace talks between disciplines. Archaeology, anthropology, law, and community representatives all trying to define stewardship in a landscape where trust had been damaged. And in a storage facility not listed in any public directory, crates sat with dust settled on their lids, artifacts cataloged, labeled, and kept under lock for reasons that straddled preservation and politics. But the story did not end in a vault. Small victories appeared in moments of human stubbornness. A local historian who had grown up on the hills published a memoir with copies of the ledger. A former contractor, now aged and guilted, came forward with testimony about the late-night orders he'd followed. A graduate student pieced together a genealogy from the letters and found living descendants who believed their oldest stories were finally being heard. The debate over access, ownership, and truth became, in itself, a new chapter of the discovery. A living argument about who gets to keep the past and who gets to learn from it. So where does that leave us? The cave still holds questions no carbon date can answer alone. Why were certain histories protected at the cost of public knowledge? How do communities heal when truths are kept secret for generations? What responsibilities do institutions have when the past shifts the moral balance of the present? Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: discoveries are never only about objects. They force a society to look at its map of values and decide whether the lines can be redrawn. If you listen closely to the record, to the ledger, the letters, the seed packets, and the hesitant voices who finally spoke, you'll hear a quieter truth underneath the drama. People acted out of fear, hope, and a wish to protect those they loved. That does not excuse secrecy, but it explains it. Tell me, if this were your town, your family, your secret to keep or reveal, what would you do?